I know we are not supposed to speak ill of the dead, and for those who might even maybe be surprised about it and haven't heard, the former president Jimmy Carter has died yesterday at the age of 100, which, as James mentioned, he was both the longest living U.S. president or a former US president that has reached the highest age, and also the longest someone who, after he left the presidency, has been able to live for the longest amount of time. Uh, but today we'll be, but when something like this happens, oftentimes you talk about those people's legacies. And unfortunately for President Carter, I don't think he has a good legacy. So today joining me is James Valliant. Welcome to the Daily Objective. So we'll go through, there are a few specific things that I think really uh, I think say a lot about Jimmy Carter's legacy, specifically when it comes to Israel. But he's not my president; he is James' president. So it's great to have him on. And James, can you just give us some of your thoughts about him, about his legacy, and then we'll go to the specific topics I have in mind.
Well, I remember him. I remember him as a young man being president. I remember him being elected initially in the wake of Watergate. I remember him. I remember his presidency vivid, with the vivid memories of being a young man. And I think that most Americans would agree with your general assessment that he was a failed president. Now, to give credit where credit is due, was everything that he did wrong? No. He well, let's start with the beginning. I mean, he basically was elected because he of Watergate. Richard Nixon had won a huge landslide, and then the Watergate scandal came out, and Gerald Ford, his successor, the Republican president who'd been his vice president after his resignation, pardoned him. And in a relatively close election, Jimmy Carter won the 1976 presidential election, perceived as a moderate, perceived as a good, decent Christian fellow. In the wake of Watergate, he became president. And he did some good things. He started America was suffering in the 1970s from inflation, and that was an intellectual watershed, I think, on economic matters for America. And so he was sort of mugged by reality, as they say. A conservative, who's not a conservative, but a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. He was mugged by reality to the extent that he appointed an inflation hawk. Now, there's no good Fed policy, but he appointed Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, and who was an inflation hawk, and sent America into a recession, but with surging interest rates and so forth. But it stomped out the inflation problem, which was very, very sticky. Stagflation, no growth, high inflation. He also began some deregulation, a significant deregulation of the trucking industry, of the airline industry, even of the oil industry, even though the consumer price of oil had to wait for Reagan to deregulate it. So in the areas of deregulation, well, to some extent, pointing an inflation hawk at the Fed, although, like I said, there's no good Fed policy, and Paul Volcker sent us into a deep recession. Nonetheless, there were things that were not what you would expect from a liberal Democrat. On the other hand, he increased federal spending dramatically. He gave us huge new bureaucracies like the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. Reagan promised but did not deliver on the promise of getting rid of the Department of Education. Maybe Doge can relook at those very departments we don't need. And Jimmy Carter gave us big new federal new departments, departments of energy and education. And there's been nothing the Republicans can do to get rid of that in the last 40 years. But I think people will mostly remember him for his foreign policy, finally getting to all that. When the Soviet Union, because remember, this was the time of the Cold War, and the Soviet Empire was still in full operation and on the march. The Soviets were on the march in Central America. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter's response was to boycott the Olympics. Now, if you're going to take a principled stand against cooperating with the Soviets, how about we start with the United Nations? which obviously having the Soviet Union on the Security Council of the United Nations meant that communist expansion could not be stopped or thwarted in any way by the United Nations, only sanction it. So while you could say, okay, he's taking a principled stance against the Olympics, oh, a real principled stance would have been to get out of the other internet, the significant international bodies and events that America cooperated with the Soviets with at the time. And most significantly, the Iranian Revolution happened in under his watch, and he really was awful in his response to that. For 444 days, I believe, U.S. diplomatic personnel were held hostage in Tehran by the new Islamic Republic, and he did nothing effective to get rid of them or to get back the U.S. diplomats. The first clear act of war, the Iranian regime under the new Ayatollah and the mullahs did a significant act of war against the United States, and he did not respond. He had a failed rescue attempt, which crashed in the desert. And on the very day that Ronald Reagan, his successor, was inaugurated president, that was the day that the hostages were released. And he was perceived as very, very weak. Now, his great achievement, if people look back and they say, well, look at his great achievement, was the peace between Egypt and Israel. Now, of course, since the late 1960s, Israel had controlled the Sinai Peninsula. And in a peace deal worked out, Jimmy Carter spent a good deal of his
Yeah,
energy.
actually, let's go to that because I wanted to go here anyway, but let me first just jump in,
Yeah,
read a few super chats. So first we have a super chat from Bonnie, thank you so much, and a super chat from Wes, thank you so much, and a super chat from Christian who mentions Camp David, so that's why I wanted to read it out.
I thought I
President
was
Carter.
getting there. Yes.
President Carter had some big achievements like the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt or the deregulation of air traffic and telecommunication, but his appeasement of Iran deserves your title. So we've talked about the deregulation. Someone in the chat said he also lowered speed limit to 55 miles per hour.
A
Is
federal
that,
speed limit.
oh
He gave
well.
us, usually things like speed limits are controlled by state and local governments. He gave us a federal speed limit, thinking that a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit would help solve our energy problem. Now, that's a very wonky and wrong approach to solving the energy crisis. It's true that the OPEC oil embargo played a role in America's inflation in the 1970s, but we had gas lines, we had even odd license plates determining when you could gas rationing. Gas rationing isn't going to do it, and nor is that going is 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. His whole idea, and Ayn Rand nailed him on this. His whole idea about the energy crisis and about living with inflation was we have to tighten our belts. Americans have to live less well. We have to cut back on our prosperity and our use of energy as such. So tighten your belts, Americans, sacrifice America. And Ayn Rand correctly nailed him on that. He was an advocate of the ethics of self-sacrifice, altruism, when it came both to foreign policy and domestic economic policy. His best suggestion was tighten your belts and live with greater austerity, America. And Americans don't respond well to that. And like I say, he lost 44 states or something like that in his re-election bid against Governor Reagan.
Yeah, so now going into first of all, we also have a super chat from Gail. Thank you so much. And I'm not a big fan of like the idea of state rights, but if there is any state right, it should be at the very least. Well, no, government should have no role when it comes to sort of controlling how fast can someone go on a private road. I would hope so. But it's surprising that the federal government would have like a law on like how fast everybody across the nation can go. So that's why I was a bit surprised to even
Yeah,
see
it's a little
that.
overreach for the federal government. Let me put it that way. I don't believe in states' rights, but I do believe in state jurisdiction, spelled out the separation of powers and the division of powers, federalism spelled out in the Constitution. I believe in, at least to some extent. States don't have rights, though.
Yeah, and uh, so now going into Camp David. So a Christian in the super chat said it was a big achievement of President Carter, the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. While I think I see it a bit differently. So, just from context, we had the war in '67, the Six-Day War, when basically Israel had, depending on how you want to claim it, technically it wasn't started by the Arab nations, although many of the Arab nations did start after Israel started it. But Egypt was already threatening for Israel, and Israel decided to do preemptive attack to because it knew that's the only way Israel is able. Israel, as a small nation, is not able to sort of have a prolonged war. It's quick and decisive victory is what Israel always goes for. That's why it's 6 days. So you had the Six-Day Wars. Later, you also had the Yom Kippur War, and afterwards, basically the results of those wars is that besides other things, as Israel was now controlling Golan Heights, West Bank, and Gaza, it was also controlling Sinai, which is a huge peninsula. I think if you compare it by the size, I think it was the twice the size of Israel, or like much bigger than or like former Israeli territory. It was a huge amount of territory, and basically as one of the results of the Camp David Accords, which was the achieving peace between Israel and Egypt, which also meant Egypt, I think, was the first Arab nation that recognized Israel, and is still like technically does recognize Israel. With that, Israel gave back Sinai Peninsula. They didn't give back Gaza. They didn't want Gazans back. They didn't want, they didn't really, because Egypt was was the one nation that was controlling Gaza. There was no Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza was controlled by Egypt. They didn't want that back, so Israel continued with that. But the idea that sort of achieving peace with Egypt is as something good. I think it's very problematic, because what we always see is every every basically there is no point of achieving peace with dictatorships. That they don't have any respect for peace, and we still know Hamas has been getting supplied from somewhere. It wasn't from the border with Israel. It was from somewhere else, and we've discovered the tunnels between through the Egyptian Gazan border. So yeah, they were getting supplied. So these are no allies, and the fact that they are viewed as uh, the idea of normalization is viewed positively, I think, in a sense, was started by President Carter. That Egypt was the first nation that sort of set the standard for the idea of normalizing relations with Arab nations. But
Yeah,
James,
it created the ephemeral idea that somehow peace could be done by negotiation, even when you're negotiating with dictators who want the destruction of Israel. And you're absolutely right. Look at what the Egyptians did. No, Israel was willing to give Gaza back along with the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, but Egypt wanted no. They wanted the Palestinian problem to persist, and so and look at everything that's happened since. Absolutely right. So much of the support for the terrorists in Gaza has come through Egypt, through the Sinai Peninsula, which they got back from Israel. And since Jimmy Carter left the presidency, he said absolutely abhorrent, ghastly things. I mean, just in the last few years, for example, his post presidency was the longest of any former president of the United States, because he's lived the longest, of course, and he was a one-term president. But he said Hamas was a worthy negotiating partner, even as he refused to meet with Netanyahu. Just in the last few years, in the years leading up to October 7th, he was saying, let's negotiate with Hamas, but I won't meet with Netanyahu. No, it's horrible what his, and Jimmy Carter, I mean, just add to it, a lot of people say he was a decent Christian man. Yeah, I think he was a sincere Christian. And I think that
that's not a good
morality,
thing.
yeah, well, the point though is that morality, that self-destructive, altruistic morality of altruism informed him. He thought that all you needed to do was show that you were willing to turn the other cheek, be peaceful, suck it up, take it Israel sort of thing, and that will convince them at the end of the day that the right thing to do is to be a Christian pacifist type person. He worked very hard on those Camp David Accords. That was really what he put a great deal of his own personal energy into, is getting Anwar Sadat to agree with Menachem Begin for this peace deal. But this peace deal did not bring peace, did it? In fact, we can just see over the last 40 years the rise of Islamism. He did nothing significant about Iran. So what we see is the rise of Islamism in the last 40 years that it was absolutely not effective. In fact, he stoked it. He put logs on the fire and put gasoline on top for the rise of Islamism. And it was that Camp David agreement and his failure to respond effectively to Iran that I think were fundamentally behind it. Now, Reagan early on didn't do much. When Hezbollah was starting to come into existence in 1983, and there were attacks in Beirut that killed so many Marines, both American and French personnel were killed in large numbers, and Ronald Reagan did nothing in response to what happened in Lebanon when Hezbollah was rising and they were killing US military personnel. And Ronald Reagan supported the Mujahideen, which became Al Qaeda in effect in Afghanistan. So both presidents, it seems to me, did irresponsible things when it came to the rise of Islamism 40 years ago or 45 years ago. Carter and Reagan sort of set up the world for the Islamic nightmare that we're living today.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Iran, so let's go actually to the hostage crisis. So after the Iranian revolution, I I don't remember how many American, basically American embassy was taken over, and there were American hostages being held in Iran.
Yeah,
Yeah,
around
in Iran.
200. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So they were held in Iran for 444 days,
Yeah,
and
both.
yeah, and I'm trying to remember. I believe Ayn Rand has commented on this situation. He said something among, unless something was done on the day of when it happened or the day after, America will never be able to live it down. And we've seen it because of the inaction of, again, Jimmy Carter was the president. Because of the inaction, he did some, symbolic stuff. I believe at some point they were asked that if the Shah of Iran, who was exiled from Iran, was returned to Iran, that he would be exchanged for hostages. And Jimmy Carter like stood up against that, and so he was viewed more positively. But again, this was such a surrendering to evil that
No.
nothing has happened like
It was an
immediately after.
act of war. It was an act of war, and it signaled the expansionist tendencies of Islamists at the time. And look at what has happened since. Every decade since that happened, we saw more and more Islamic terrorism. And now in the 21st century, we've been dealing with things like 9/11 and October 7th, missile assaults from Iran straight onto Israel. Think of all the Islamic terrorism over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, really, by the 1990s, you're beginning to see all kinds of Islamist terrorism everywhere, bombings and embassies in Africa, you name embassies in South America. But the Islamists were on the march ever since. Ayn Rand nailed it. There was no effective response, and you had to be quick and you had to be strong in that response. Ayn Rand was right about that. But our policies in the 1970s really set us up for the 90s and the 21st century and all the Islamic violence that we've seen. Absolutely. That is on Jimmy Carter's head. And you can see he had no understanding of the philosophical issues at stake or how he played into that. He was still defending Hamas as a legitimate negotiating partner just a few years ago, even as I say, he wouldn't meet with Netanyahu. That is monstrous. And that show, but as I say, that's an expression of his sincere Christianity, I think. Yeah, Ayn Rand was a trenchant critic of this and a prophetic critic, but of course she was just seeing reality for what it was. It wasn't some magic X-ray vision. She could actually see that a failure to respond to something like that could only have disastrous consequences.
Yeah, I mean, today we're talking about the legacy, and if you think about what legacy is, it's something that sort of lives after you, that the effects of we basically sort of resonate throughout the history. And, you know, if you go into the past, nobody, at least I have no idea what George Washington did as a president. One thing I do know is he stepped down after his 2 terms, and that resonated with the idea of what it means to be president. The fact that it's a limited role. It's a something. It's a, you know, sort of the idea of the Cincinnatus from ancient Rome. Basically, you do your civic duty and then you stop that, or your civic responsibility, and then you have to step down. And in a similar way, this idea of not responding to Iran is now, well, you know, just the material effect, the fact that Iran was able to persevere and exist. But now no one is standing up to Iran. Decades go and decades go, and we still have, I mean, now we at least have Israel in some cases straight up attacking Iran, but is not able, at least we don't yet have seen it, able to bring down the whole regime. America is the one nation that can easily bring down not just Iran, pretty much any regime they would want at any point. Yet, and you know, this is not like recommending just go put down regimes for whatever reason. But when it comes to Iran, something should have been done, you know, during on the day of the hostage crisis. That should have been a hostage crisis. That should have been a declaration of war from Iran on America, and you know, the Wikipedia entry should look much more different when it comes to this, and it definitely shouldn't say it lasted 444 days. And that's what I mean. I mentioned Wikipedia, which I found a really interesting, like quote from Jimmy Carter on Wikipedia. Apparently, he said after this happened, he said the hostage taking was an act of blackmail, and the hostages are victims of terrorism and anarchy. And it's almost like tautological statement. Like, yeah, that's what hostage taking means. It's an act of blackmail. You're trying to like
It's
so
act of war to
yeah.
seize diplomatic personnel. I mean, that's an overt act of war. And of course, America has let act of war after act of war after act of war from Iran in particular happen again and again and again with no response. And now they're on the verge of getting nuclear weapons. Okay. America's response to Iran, the Iranian Revolution, was set by Carter. And even Reagan didn't do much to change that. As I say, his failures in Beirut in particular are noteworthy. But no president since Carter has done any better. And look at the result. And look at the result. But it began then. And Ayn Rand was exactly right. If there wasn't a decisive and quick response, a really forceful and response, and you don't want to drag your feet on this, the longer you wait, the harder it is politically and the less the effect. But we let it happen, and now look at the world 45 years later.
And someone in the chat says USA dropped the atomic bomb, and this to blabber on about Iran. Again, this is
That was
the
a heroic
idea.
thing that America did. Thank God, America, and I'm an atheist, thank God America spared both American and Japanese lives in doing that and decisively changed the government and culture, even of Japan in doing so. It may have spared millions of lives, the dropping of those bombs. And it
Yeah,
certainly changed the whole landscape in Japan in terms of their politics and entering the modern world and having such a so much better government and culture in Japan today. Directly the result of those nuclear bombs. So thank God they did.
yeah. I mean, yesterday we've
Oh,
talked about.
that whoever says that would think that, of course, Dresden was terrible and the invasion of Normandy was a hate crime. I mean, think of just the conventional bombings of Tokyo and Germany during World War II, and all the people that that killed. Should we have just laid down for the Nazis and for Chojo's Japan? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, this idea. Yesterday we've talked about this idea of being biased, and the idea that you would look at any conflict as if as only if how many bullets were fired by each side, and that's how you decide who is right.
Right.
Is simply at the very least terrible way to evaluate any conflict. But at the actual way of like saying it is truly evil way of deciding on any topic. You have to look at what are the sides standing for and what is this conflict about. And when you are discussing the difference between Iran and America, and that you would look at as America is the more evil one because they've dropped an atomic bomb. Again, it's
It's
not.
intrinsicist, turn
Yeah.
the other cheek mentality that comes from Christianity. And let me just name Jimmy Carter's sincere Christianity as the problem. Yeah, that's the problem. If you think that it is obvious that the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was evil, then you'd be in favor of all the appeasement that created October 7th or 9/11. That's what you're in favor of. This kind of Christian appeasement that has an intrinsicist view. You can't kill anybody. You've got to turn the other cheek. And at some point, when you're done turning the other cheek, somehow the bad guy is going to fold up his tent and move away and say, "Oh, geez, you're so moral and so nice. We agree." No, that's never going to happen. When savages aggressively attack you, you've got to annihilate them. You've got to push them back with everything you've got. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for ongoing, never ending, ceaseless war, which is exactly what we've seen for the last half century in the Middle East. It is exactly that kind of Christian turn the other cheek policy that Jimmy Carter more exemplifies than any other US president that has led to the problem. You cannot approach this with Christian ethics, with the ethics of altruism.
Yeah, and again, just going to the idea of atomic bomb, and that when we criticize the idea of Iran developing nuclear weapon, as if that's like the problem is that any nation developing a nuclear weapon is bad. No, it's a dictatorship that is poised on destroying the West, developing a nuclear weapon.
The fact that
That's
Great Britain,
problematic.
the fact that Great Britain and France and the United States have nuclear weapons is not the problem. They're not going to start a war with it. Okay? That's not the problem, ladies and gentlemen. Iran, religious fanatics, not even atheistic communists, but religious fanatics getting the bomb. Now that's a significant problem, ladies and gentlemen. It's as you point out, the principle is when a dictatorship has a terrible weapon of war, that's a bad thing. When a relatively free country, a liberal democracy has it, that's a good thing. A capitalist society that protects individual rights, that's a good thing. Israel having nuclear bombs isn't the problem. It's Iran, for gosh sakes.
Yeah, and just quickly, the same troll in the chat says war creates more war. Yeah, of course it does. That's why we are still dealing with like Japanese neo-Shintoists and with like half of Germany is like neo-Nazis that are still like trying to destroy the West. No, the war, a correct way of waging a war ends war and
So you
ends
wouldn't
war.
want the Civil War and you'd want slavery to persist in the South? What? No. When you're faced with a horror like slavery, when you're faced with a horror like Islamism, you have to deal, or international communism in the day, you have to deal with it forcefully. If you don't deal with it forcefully, you're sanctioning its existence. Once the aggressor gets away with his aggression, you think they're just going to stop? No. You have to act decisively in self-defense. I mean, this pacifist nonsense is the sanction of aggression. Full stop.
Um, so yeah, that much about President Jimmy Carter. Unfortunately, not a very good legacy, and we are still hearing, well, in a sense, hearing sort of the echoes of his administration still now with the cases of Iran, with the cases of the Middle East, Israel, and more broadly even of the he sort of set out what sort of policy we are going to have with Iran. But James, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I will give Jimmy Carter, as I say, little credit here and there for things, but when it comes to foreign policy, it was a nightmare. He set up the Middle East as it is today. He would never have brought down the Soviet Empire. Let me give credit where credit is due to Ronald Reagan and to Margaret Thatcher. They're the ones whose strong policy against the Soviets helped bring it down. It was never going to be Jimmy Carter. He could never have done that. And So his foreign policy was weak and created so many of the world's problems today. Helped create it. Oh, obviously, I'm not going to defend Nixon and Reagan and everything they did, but Jimmy Carter, in terms of foreign policy, was really, really bad and really helped set up the Middle East as we see it today. There's no question about it in my mind.
And we'll continue talking on the reality show starting in just about a minute or so. It's going to be the Palestinian people in their own words. There was a new sort of street interview done with specifically the young Palestinians. So we'll listen to them what they think about two-state solution, one-state solution, what they think is the proper resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So make sure to check out that. The link is in the chat starting in just about a minute or so. Thank you, James, for joining me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and bye-bye.
Be safe.